He is well worth waiting for. It's Ethan Nadelmann, also from the USA. And to introduce him again is Myrtle.
So when we were planning bringing out our experts, Sean Shelley, who you all know runs the Drug Policy Week, and I were having a little email sparring competition. And I said to him, well, I've got David Nutt. And he said, oh, well, do you think you can lend him to me?
Good.
So I said, well, I'll think about it. Maybe it'll cost you something. And then it just so happened that Julian and I were invited to speak at the Harm Reduction Conference in Montreal in May. It was an amazing experience because it was a drug policy conference that had about at least a third of its content about cannabis. And while we were there, Sean was also there, as were some other members of this audience.
Where can I put my bag?
Sean came up to me and he says,
Oh, yeah.
I've got Ethan. I said, no, you haven't got Ethan. Ethan Nadelmann is just the most amazing drug warrior that you have ever heard. I guarantee you. And it's not possible to say that I've left the best for the last because we've had the best of the best all the way through today. But I think it was in a lift in the Marriott Hotel in Montreal that Sean said to me, well, I'll give you Ethan if you give me David. So it all works out in the end. And I'm very, very pleased to introduce our next speaker, somebody who came into our lives when we didn't know that we would need to know so much about drug policy. Ethan Nadelmann is widely regarded as the outstanding proponent of drug policy reform, both in the United States and abroad, and is founder and former director of the Drug Policy Alliance. For many years, he has been the main driving force behind drug policy reform in the USA and is credited with providing the impetus for the ever-increasing number of states that are legalizing cannabis in the USA. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome an amazing warrior, Dr. Ethan Nadelmann.
Thank you, Myrtle. Okay, I'm last. And you've been here a long time. Could I just get a show of hands? How many of you have never smoked cannabis? Please raise your hands. Wow, that's an impressive number. There's still time yet. I have to say, it's so inspiring. This is my first time ever in South Africa, and it was inspiring being in. I mean, I've been wanting to come here for a long time, but I was waiting for something to happen so somebody could invite me. And then Sean organized the second of his drug policy weeks in Cape Town, and now Myrtle and Jules organizing, I guess this is the first major cannabis reform conference in this country. So seems like a wonderful week, and it's wonderful for me to be part of this. Most of my life has been spent in my own country advocating for reform of drug policies there. But I have found the opportunity to go around the world and to try to help allies around the world advance things as well. And I've done that with my speaking and advising, and also by creating organizations in the U.S. that could help empower these efforts around the world. So, I mean, I think what I can do here, just another question. Is there anybody here who actually opposes the decriminalization or legalization of cannabis? Raise your hand. Okay. So I mean, except for the couple of you who dare not raise your hand and really don't agree, and the one or two undercover people, hello, I hope you're doing well and enjoying the day and listening and learning. I thought what I could most do is sort of provide some perspective from my country about how we did what we did, and to talk a little bit about what's happening around the rest of the world, and essentially put this into the perspective of the broader global drug policy reform effort. Because ultimately I believe that our obligation is not just to end the prohibition of cannabis in ways that are responsible and thoughtful, but it's actually to promote sensible and pragmatic drug policies regarding all the other drugs as well. It's not the role of the cannabis reform movement to say, distance ourselves from all these other drugs and to say, we deserve to be legal, we deserve to be decriminalized, we should not be treated as criminals, while those people hurl your criminal laws and your punitive prohibitions and your prejudices at them. It's not to say that the way we treat cannabis should ultimately be the same as the way that we treat all these other substances, but it's to understand that this is part of a broader struggle for sensible and sane drug control policies. So I hope that most of you agree with that basic sentiment, and that no matter how much you may be aware of people who have struggled with heroin or methamphetamine or other drugs, it doesn't lead you to make a fundamental break in terms of how you look at the broader sets of issues around these things. Okay, I mean, that's also my appeal to you, because I've sometimes had to deal with allies in the United States who would say, well, let's legalize cannabis so that we can crack down on those other drugs. No. I mean, maybe if you want to say so we can more effectively crack down on rape or murder or gross white-collar theft, yes, okay. But not so we can crack down on other people who consume prohibited substances. So I've been involved in this in the U.S. for really all my adult life. I mean, for now roughly 30 years, and studying it even before then. And what I can say, I guess, is a few things. When we started on this, and this is meant, I mean, I don't know if there's much in the way of really legitimate public opinion polls on this issue. Because I know, one of the things is people come together, and it's like the faithful coming into I don't want to call it a church, but coming together to sort of, be educated and to find sustenance in being in the company of other people who are like-minded in various ways. And it's always a good reality check to take a look at public opinion polls if they're there, and to understand that oftentimes we are confronting monumental opposition. And we sometimes think that the power of our arguments and the power of everything you heard today must be so overwhelming that if only everybody could hear it, then inevitably the prohibition laws would fall and freedom would reign, right? We know that in this country and elsewhere there's a long way to go. Now, when we started back in the mid-1980s, only 25% of Americans thought that marijuana should be legal. And that was actually down, because in the late 1970s, it had actually gone up to 30%. There had been a period in the late 1970s, that was a period when I was in college, when people thought, oh, legalization is just a matter of time. 11 states had decriminalized the possession of marijuana. Our president, Jimmy Carter, had proposed a federal decriminalization, not legalization, but decriminalization bill. It was sort of part of the culture. You could smoke marijuana almost openly in some places. And I remember thinking, yeah, it just makes sense. But a few things happened. One was, we didn't look closely at the polling, because even back then, only 30% of Americans believed that marijuana should be legal. Youth culture was kind of surging at that time, so it felt like something was changing, but there was a whole swath of the population, the majority, that was aghast at the idea. And then something else happened. An anti-marijuana parents movement emerged. Some of them just people legitimately concerned about their kids and marijuana, but others of them sort of fanatical anti-marijuana types of the sorts that have brought on us alcohol prohibition earlier in the 20th century. And they began to mobilize and to attract attention and to be able to publish in the mainstream places and get the attention of TV. And then Ronald Reagan came along in the sort of conservative counter-revolution, mobilizing these people. And I'll tell you, that sense of momentum that we had in the late 70s, sort of before my time, but my predecessors, really almost disappeared from history. And this offers the first warning, which is, even when it feels like the wind is at your back and momentum is growing, don't get careless. Don't get overconfident. Overconfidence is sometimes one of the greatest failings of activists. And watch also what's happening. By 1979, the surveys were showing that 10% of all high school juniors or seniors, 17-year-olds, let's say, claimed to be smoking marijuana daily, which was actually defined as 25 days a month. That was a real issue. Because when you have 10% of high school kids saying they're smoking daily, and all the fears of parents around their teenagers and marijuana and their kids going through vulnerable periods of time, and we all know the problem, kids waking and baking, waking up in the morning, smoking their weed and going to school and not really learning anything except maybe pottery or something. But but that was a real issue for which the first generation of activists were not prepared to deal with. It's another lesson. Be careful, understand, right, that as Sean said before, marijuana is not good for everybody. I think we all know people for whom marijuana is not good for, who get delusional, who get stupid, who get lazy, who exemplify what the anti-marijuana people say about people who use marijuana. And that reality there is something that we have to be attentive to. So when the new movement began to grow in the late 80s, early 90s, around, and in a sense, it was really medical marijuana that offered us the traction. Now, mind you, when I'm telling about the United States, it's not to say what worked here is going to work here, or what we did there will work here. And in fact, as you look around the world, you realize that every country has to do things in their own sort of way. But when in the late 1980s, we had a period, an absolutely hysterical drug war. Legislators, both not just Republicans, but Democrats, conservatives and liberals, white and black, just doubling and tripling and quadrupling the criminal penalties on drugs. It was, I call it something like McCarthyism on steroids, right? It was a notion of an almost crusade-like mentality, that we will march to Jerusalem no matter how many people we kill, how many people we die. We must attain a drug-free society, no matter the cost, right? And in that hysterical period, people just got swept up the way people do in wars. Well, we began to see by the early to mid-90s that there were a few issues that the public was saying the drug war had gone too far on. One was the view that people who had a drug addiction and got picked up for drugs should be given a chance for treatment, not prison. The other was that people who could legitimately benefit from marijuana as a medicine and for whom a doctor would give a recommendation should be allowed to get it. And so we have in the United States, in about half of our states, the ability to organize a citizens' initiative, a ballot initiative, a referendum, to put a law to the public, right? Switzerland has that, some other countries has it, Italy has it, I don't think you do. But what it meant was that in those jurisdictions where public opinion was at our side, but where the politicians were afraid or fearful or unwilling to move forward, we had the option of putting a vote directly to the people about whether to change the law. And some activists had organized, drafted a law, a very open-ended law in California. And then I had just left university and began my organization, was positioned to know the people who could produce the money and all this. And we created a professional campaign. And in 1996, we won that first medical marijuana ballot initiative in California, legalizing the right of doctors to recommend marijuana to patients and patients to use it and for them to grow their own. And when people say, well, why did you do that? Somebody's like, oh, that's just a subterfuge. It's not really about medical marijuana. You just want to legalize weed so all you guys can get high. Well, there was some truth to that. But the real truth was that we were doubly motivated. That on the one hand, we believed, and by we I mean the key leaders of this effort, that in an era of a drug war and marijuana prohibition, cannabis prohibition, that those people who were really using cannabis for medical purposes had a right to be first in line, to be an exception to the prohibition laws. That they had that much of a greater right than did those of us who use cannabis recreationally. And it was important. And then there was the second argument, which was that we had reason to believe in some polling that suggested that opening up the discussion around the medical use of marijuana and the legalization of it would help to transform the public discussion and debate around marijuana. And in retrospect, we see that, in fact, it did that. There were medical marijuana purists who hated the association of the legalizers. There were legalizers who thought, oh, by legalizing medical marijuana, you're going to remove the momentum for broader reform. But in the end, and in retrospect, and we correctly perceived back then, that was neither here nor there. Medical marijuana in our case, and it's proved true in a number of other countries as well, was a way to get our foot in the door, help those people who most needed the help, and to begin to transform the dialogue. What else did we do? Well, we were very conscious of the imagery. You know, when I began getting involved in the debates over drug reform and legalization in the late 80s, early 90s, and I was a Princeton professor, and we had a mayor of Baltimore and former police chiefs on our side, and prominent conservative intellectuals like Milton Friedman and William Buckley, and we would do interviews in the major news magazines, and then instead of the news magazines putting our pretty faces in a tie and a jacket, they would pull out some stock photo of some 17-year-old white kid with blonde dreadlocks and hemp leaves in his hair, you know, with a sign that hemp will save the universe, right? We needed to change that imagery. And part of that meant being conscious of how we appeared. It meant that those of us who did dress that way, although they were still going to advocate in the way that they did, and that was fine, but it meant that where we had the ability to shape the imagery, it became people who were using marijuana as medicine. It became the woman who had just gone through chemotherapy. It became the young man living with AIDS and AIDS wasting syndrome. It became the person with multiple sclerosis. It became the mother of that 2-year-old child with a form of epilepsy, Dravet syndrome, where medical marijuana was so incredibly beneficial. When we ran TV ads or did newspaper ads, those people became much more the face. And then when the opportunities emerged to go and testify in front of legislatures, we made sure it was those people, somebody wheeling in a wheelchair because they had multiple sclerosis, possibly daring to engage in the act of civil disobedience by pulling out their medicine and lighting up in a public place. But the fact of the matter is, when they offered their testimony, you could barely see a dry eye in the legislative hall, even among the most cold-hearted Republicans. So it was thinking about the imagery of this as well. Now there's a third point here. We were attentive to our arguments. For me and for many others, the most fundamental argument was the right of personal sovereignty, that I and each one of us are personally sovereign over our own minds and bodies, and that the state has no right to take away our sovereignty over our own mind and body in this particular area. Right? Those are the arguments we've just heard in terms of your Constitution. They are arguments that we tried to make in my country constitutionally. But you know what? We almost never made those arguments, at least not as our first line or our second or our third line, in part because the constitutional efforts in my country of the sort that you're pursuing here now had already been lost in prior decades. And so we saw we had no traction at that time to do it. But beyond that, we understood that this was a battle for the minds and hearts of the American public, that we needed to win over the average American. We needed to win over the middle-class American parent who maybe never smoked marijuana, or if they did it a long time ago and maybe had a good or bad experience, and who were freaked out about their kids and what might happen. And therefore, we did our research. And what we found was that two arguments, almost everywhere we looked, were the ones that seemed to win over the person who was ambivalently in the middle. The first argument was that we'd rather have the cops focusing on real crime instead of busting young people for a little bit of weed. And the second argument was we'd rather have the government taxing this stuff and using the money for good purposes instead of putting the money in the hands of gangsters. Those two arguments over and over and over. So all the other arguments that marijuana is less dangerous than alcohol, that I have a right to use it, that blah, 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 blah. Sometimes what we would do is we'd reach agreement among the various allied groups that anybody could make any argument they wanted until Labor Day, early September, 2 months before we were going to have a ballot initiative on Election Day in November. And that for the last 2 months, everybody abandoned all their other arguments about personal right, personal sovereignty, marijuana being less dangerous than alcohol, and we all agreed just to focus on those two arguments because we knew we needed to move people over in our direction. We were also attentive, of course, to the broader language. Legalize, decriminalize, what do you do? What's the best? I remember seeing polls 10, 12 years ago, and if you pull them all together, what you found was that there was a moment I remember thinking that if you asked Americans, do you want, do you, do you, are you in favor, would you say legalize marijuana? And 30% would say yes. And then we'd ask, how about make marijuana legal? 35% would say yes. There was something, I think, about dropping that hard Z, that Z, legalize, that, somehow pushed us up a little bit. And then we would say, would you support treating marijuana more or less like alcohol? Tax it, control it, regulate it, and try to keep kids from getting in trouble with it. 40% said yes. Well, I mean, that told me be attentive to our language. Tax, control, regulate, and educate became the motivating words in the late 90s and early 2000s because that's something that people can relate to. Even people who are anti-tax, they like the idea of taxing marijuana because it meant taxing somebody else's vice in order to reduce their own taxes. We went with what worked. Control and regulate, the same thing. But say it, people like control and regulate. People here legalize, they think free for all, free market. So we talk about tax, control, and regulate because that's a way of making clear that the alternative to prohibition is a system of regulation. People make the assumption that prohibition represents the ultimate form of regulation, when in fact prohibition represents the abdication of regulation, in which there is no control by the state, and it's only controlled essentially by illicit market forces. On the other hand, we always knew that we were starting off with 60% support for legalizing medical marijuana, and now it's up to 85%, even higher in the US. So we would use the word legalize with respect to medical marijuana, because we knew people were already so much in favor of legalizing medical marijuana that using the word legalize with medical marijuana was a way of making the legalized word a little more innocuous, a little less threatening. So that attention to language, of thinking about this in strategic ways and where we could mobilize concentrated resources focusing that way, it was part of what worked for us. Now mind you, even us advocates didn't see it coming as fast as we did. And it's remarkable, the Gallup poll, our most famous public opinion poll in the United States, is called the Gallup poll. And if you go up on Gallup, Gallup, and plug in marijuana, and then you plug in marriage equality or gay marriage, what you see is that public opinion lined up almost exactly on the two issues. That in 2004, you had roughly 34% of Americans in favor both of legalizing gay marriage and legalizing marijuana. And by 2014, it had gone up to something like 54%. The two issues where the rest of the country was turning conservative in some ways, these ones move forward sort of in tandem. And I think sometimes for related reasons. We know, of course, that the willingness of people to come out was important. In gay rights, of course, right? And with marijuana. Somebody would say, 50 years ago, everybody in America knew a homosexual. They just didn't know they knew a homosexual. And therefore, their image of who was a homosexual was what they saw on TV or in horror films or somebody getting arrested in a men's room or somebody who was flamboyantly gay. And they had all these negative attitudes. Of course, now everybody in America knows somebody who's homosexual, who's gay or lesbian. And there could be some family member, their boss or their colleague or employee or their friend, whatever it might be. And their attitudes have transformed dramatically. Well, the fact is everybody in my country and yours today knows not just a cannabis user, but another illicit drug user. They just don't know they do. And therefore, their image of who is the consumer is shaped powerfully by fearful imagery, propaganda, all of this sort of stuff. So the element of the willingness and finding the ways to be able to come out was pivotally important as well. Now, let me jump forward here. We have, as you know, been enormously successful in my country. People marvel at it. 29 states have now legalized medical marijuana. 8 states, including California, have legalized more broadly adult use. We always talk about, we, by the way, try to talk not about recreational use, but adult use. It's another way of being attentive to language. Because remember, if you think about medical or recreational, I mean, quite frankly, it's not all the same, but you can think of that use as sort of along a continuum. Right? From the most medical, serious people who don't like the psychoactive effects of marijuana using it as medicine, to people doing it purely to feel good, and everything in between. Right? We see, for example, that what's happened last few years since legalization, has adolescent use of cannabis increased? No. I mean, there's dozens of studies, a few suggest yes here and there, but most say no. Why? Well, because who's had the best access to cannabis for the last 40 years? Young people, right? I mean, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 or 40 years ago, who has the best access to cannabis in my country and probably yours? It's young people. It's teenagers. For a long time, when people would ask in my circles, do you know where we can get some marijuana? The most common answer was, have you asked your teenager? I mean, so for young people, legalization, and it's not legal for them anyway. The laws only affect people over the age of 21. It's not legal for them anyway, so it doesn't really, legalization doesn't affect them all that much. The price may go down a bit, but that's about it. But where do we see the increase in cannabis use? It's among older people. It's among people in their 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, 80s, even 90s, right? It's people finding that they prefer marijuana. And these are sometimes people who smoked when they were younger and stopped, people who never smoked but now are getting intrigued. It's people who found that they prefer it to the sleeping pill, that little nibble off the marijuana pretzel each night. People who found they preferred it to the antidepressant. People who found they preferred it to the drink at the end of the night. People who found they were struggling with keeping their alcohol use under control, and cannabis was helpful in that area. People who found that it was not a bad way to spice up a long-term marriage. That's part of our growth group right now. So that's also been a key element in this stuff. And we've been very careful about emphasizing the importance of responsible regulation, of labeling, the importance of quality control, over how these things are produced, how they're sold, over all of these sorts of controls. Now, I realize I'm sort of jumping ahead here in South Africa. You're not there yet. You're not close. But these sorts of issues, I think, are really going to be among the pivotally important ones. Now, here's what I can say about the last details of legalization. I am concerned, as are so many here, that legalization, I have two things I don't like about our success. One is that the more marijuana becomes legal, the more we lose the intimacy of the cannabis consuming subculture. That sense of bonding and sharing, that little element of hiding, that element of trust. Well, when it's all legal, I'm already missing that a bit. I mean, in a way, it's like the loss of the speakeasy culture from prohibition, right? And the other thing, of course, is big business. It is, I live in the single most dynamic capitalist society in world history, so I know how these things work. And there's going to be no way, ultimately, to truly prevent the domination of this industry by big industry, right? We know tobacco company, so long as it's illegal under federal law, they're hanging back big alcohol, big pharmaceutical, big consumer good. But as marijuana goes from being legalized to more and more states to being legalized at the federal level, we're going to see them coming in. We're going to see them buying up the best producers, paying the best talent, producing highest quality, most refined products. Already we see in California large landowners getting ready to buy in the Central Valley where we produce many of our fruits and vegetables and such. So it's going to happen. The question is, can we make some efforts along the way to limit that, to protect it a bit? Right? So, and that's why when you look at where to look for models of legalization, I say look beginning, at least in my country, at California. Because in California, when Sean was talking about talk to the stakeholders, we interviewed hundreds of people as we were drafting the California law. Hundreds of people from all elements of industry, medicine, da-da-da-da. Right? We made an effort so that, for example, there are 20 different levels of licenses. We made a special license for people growing plots barely the size of this stage so that they would pay the lowest fees, and those with the biggest plots would have to pay the most. We passed a law that basically said that the ones who wanted big mega grows can't do it for the first 5 or 10 years, and then once they do, they cannot become vertically integrated, which means that you have to choose between being involved in production or distribution. So we made those sorts of efforts, right? We also did things in making these laws to try to deal with the harms that had stemmed from the problems of the previous prohibitionist policies. So we said, for example, that if you've ever been convicted of a drug violation, not just for cannabis, you can still apply to get a license to be a legal marijuana seller, right? The public was not supportive of that, but because they supported the bigger picture, they went for that. We said that young people can no longer be given criminal convictions, and that for those who have them, they have to be wiped clean when they hit the age of 18 or 21. We said that 5% of the tax revenue, which is anticipated to be up to $1 billion a year and more in California in a few years, must go specifically to benefit those communities that were harmed by the war on drugs. People talk about reparations. We actually wrote a form of reparations into that California law, right? And we made 60% of the revenue go for youth programs, and we wrote the youth programs so they wouldn't be bullshit anti-drug programs, but they'd in fact be real programs to help kids in struggling communities, right? You know? I mean, and the fact is we won votes that way. When we were drafting the Colorado law in 2012, we put in there that some of the money had to go for school construction, right? And in fact, you had conservatives who were anti-marijuana who voted for the legalization bill because they saw it as a tax marijuana to pay for school construction bill. So it was just we put in money in there for law enforcement, but only for law enforcement in those towns and cities which agreed to allow retail establishments. If they didn't, no money. And we put in a little money for research. And in some cases, we put in some money for drug treatment. So we were able to direct the tax revenue to things that people saw would be good things, not just being absorbed in the general treasury or whatever it might be. So all of these things are potential less. Now, mind you, this is the variety of American models. And the truth is, Alaska is different from Oregon, is different from Nevada, is different from California, is different from Maine, right? There's basic similarities. The model in Uruguay, pretty good model. You know, tripartite model, right? Anybody can grow their own up to a few plants, which we also have in most states. You know, the cooperative, the cannabis clubs model coming out of Spain that Uruguay adopts, and then a pharmacy model. We went for a model on taxation that said that set the taxation rate at a level high enough to discourage consumption, but low enough to undercut the black market. But Uruguay went for a very low tax, right? To basically say, let's eliminate the black market, but, you know, once again, trade-offs. Now you see Canada, which is going to set up a legal regulatory system next year. They're going to have other models, and they may vary from one province to another. Go to Switzerland, where various cities are now trying to consider how should they legally regulate. Czech Republic is considering this. The Dutch are trying to figure out how do they finally legalize the back door, the retail side. So you're beginning to see more and more models along these lines, and I think that sort of innovation and debate is going to be what's needed. To some extent, the more you start talking about those questions now, the more it makes the whole thing begin to feel real. Okay, let me just finish by saying these basic things. I am inspired, especially in these last two presentations by Don and Paul Michael. Your Constitution, wow, incredible. Wow, one of the best constitutions in the world, and it's pretty new. What percent of South Africans would vote to approve that Constitution today? Would you have majority support for approving your current Constitution? Would you? Maybe. I know in America you couldn't get majority support for our First Amendment anymore. And I would wager that if you still can get majority support for your Constitution today, it's quite likely, especially as the forces of darkness continue to spread all around the world, that a few years down the road, people will no longer support the bold and radical South African Constitution within South Africa. Right? It will be seen as something that a new generation of people, you know, will not see as part of their cultural or historical or political DNA, but be aware of that. You have this great opportunity with your Constitution, but ultimately winning the hearts of the public is pivotally important. I make the case in the United States that, you know, that our First Amendment, our freedom of speech, press, religion, and assembly is perhaps the best thing that's kept America great, right? With all our power and all our things in our bigger Constitution, people find ways to scam the Constitution. Our Constitution is now responsible for 2 times in the last 16 years, the presidential candidate becoming the person who got fewer votes landing up in the White House because of the way our Constitution is drafted. So constitutions land up being taken advantage of and flawed and reflecting historical compromises that no longer make sense into the future. But our First Amendment, the freedom of speech, press, religion, and assembly, right? That has kept us honest. That has kept America a basically free country for over 200 years, notwithstanding our history of slavery and oppression and all the other terrible things that have happened in my country. Right? Now, and I would also believe that on some level, that that underlying that basic First Amendment freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly is another freedom that our founding fathers simply assumed because they thought it could never be endangered, which is freedom of consciousness. Our ability to shape our own consciousness, our own minds through the information, even the substances that we take into our minds and bodies. Right? Now, what does freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly even mean if you don't have a fundamental freedom of consciousness? That the flip side of saying I have the freedom to consume this substance is saying I also have the freedom not to have the government shove a drug into my body to try to do things to me. Right? They're 2 sides of the same coin. Now, we also know these freedoms are not absolute, right? America has a tremendous freedom of speech, but that does not give me the right to yell fire in a crowded theater falsely. We have tremendous freedom of press, but I cannot libel. We have tremendous freedom of religion, but I cannot engage in animal sacrifices and other things that might be regarded as religious necessities based upon the Bible. I can assemble a group in a public place, but I cannot assemble a mob to do bad things. So we know that our freedoms here are not absolute. I fundamentally believe, right, that there is no legitimate basis in medicine, in science, in ethics, or for that matter, the Bible, in discriminating against or distinguishing amongst people based solely upon the substance that we put into our bodies. That there is no legitimate basis for distinguishing against or amongst people based upon the substance we put into our bodies. That the only legitimate basis is distinguishing among those people who do no harm to others and those who do harm to others. And that people who go out and steal and rape and murder need to be held responsible. And if they claim they did it because they're a drug addict, they still need to be held responsible, even if the way they're treated by the state should be adjusted because they reflected their addiction or their situation. That's what it means to live in a responsible moral way in a responsible moral society, right? It means that if, God forbid, you're a parent who has 2 kids addicted to drugs, one addicted to booze and one addicted to heroin, there should be and there can be no legitimate basis for discriminating or distinguishing how those 2 children are treated in the eyes of the law. That is first and foremost the fundamental reason why a movement for the legalization and the decriminalization of cannabis needs to embrace this broader cause. Right? It doesn't mean that we're going to legalize all the substances to allow retail sales, but it means that. In Cape Town, I was so inspired to meet people engaged in the sort of underground therapeutic use of mushrooms. People, doing like the Lord's work and like helping people who've been traumatized illegally at legal risk without any medical doctors around. Not that that would hurt, but doing it because it's the right thing to do. So I do believe in that principle, and if South Africa is able to enshrine something resembling that principle in its constitution, and if it can begin with cannabis and somehow go more broadly, then that would be a wonderful thing for the world. Because, I was saying to the activists in Cape Town the other day, even though this country and this continent lags so far behind the rest of the world on pragmatic drug policy reform, the Europeans led with their harm reduction policies, the US and Uruguay have led with cannabis regulation, the Latin Americans have led with generating the broader debate around legalization, and Africa, not much in the lead on anything regarding drug policy. Only 5 countries, Mauritius, Tanzania, Kenya, South Africa, and Senegal, even have needle exchange and methadone programs now, even though many more could benefit from it, and not much happening in the way of cannabis reform. But the question always, as you're playing catch-up, when all the evidence exists all around the world that this is the thing to do, And it's just a matter of getting the lughead public and politicians to understand, and you're just playing catch up so that you can do the right thing here the way that Western Europe and Australia and Canada and the US and Uruguay and other countries are doing, you still always want to be looking for an opportunity to do something that nobody else has done. Now, if you, through your Constitution and the cases happening here, can break that through, or if you, in dealing with the problems of people struggling with drugs on the street, can come up with a South African model, a harm reduction approach, perhaps embedded in local cultural values, that not just works here, but that has values for other societies, then you too can and will lead. You know, it's an honor to be here in South Africa at this time. It's an honor to be feeling the sort of birth of a nascent movement for cannabis and broader drug policy reform. You know, it's a wonderful thing to come here to the place. You know, for me, when I was growing up in college in the 70s, 80s, when the anti-apartheid struggle was sort of the one active political thing on even American campuses, right? And it was successful, and it won. And it won without massive levels of violence. And it, for all its flaws and all its weaknesses, it remains one of the great moral success stories of the last couple of generations. It's a tragedy for me to come here and hear people who were associated and fought in the struggle against apartheid mouthing the same sorts of anti-drug arguments that the defenders of apartheid once argued back then when responding with people who are black and colored and Asian, what have you. But it means that you who are part of this movement are basically standing on the shoulders and following in the footsteps of that movement within this country to end apartheid. You are part of a broader global drug policy reform movement. You are part of a broader global movement for human rights. And in the face of rising authoritarianism and Donald Trumpism and Putinism and urbanism in Hungary and all of the horrible things we're seeing, that for that type of sentiment to grow here and for drugs, the drug issue, the cannabis issue to be the pivot point, the point at which we grow, empower, and influence and take our values in ways that begin to spill more broadly into the broader society, in the same ways that your anti-apartheid values spilled into your constitution and the origins of your new country here, well then, the struggle for drug policies grounded in science, compassion, health, and human rights, that's a struggle worth committing your lives to. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Phew. Okay. I can't say anything after that, except that the cash bar is open.
Oh, thank
I
you
have
very
to say
much.
a few words. One thing on behalf of
Okay.
Jules and Myrtle, who've been involved in the trial, they'd just like me to thank the people in the background of this whole event. There are a lot of people that put a huge amount of time and effort in today and previously, and so please give a big hand for the crew behind the scenes. Right. So I've just got a few words to say, and having heard them speak, I'm sure you'll agree with me that we can be extremely optimistic that the expert witnesses and legal counsel we met today will have no trouble convincing the judge at the trial of the plant that the South African drug laws are indeed unconstitutional. And for that, the whole country will be indebted to the judges, the witnesses, and especially Myrtle and Jules. So once again, thank you all for showing your support by attending South Africa's first ever clinical convention that I hope will be the first of many, many more. Travel safely, and thank you for coming.